Welcome back, everyone. We are here today on Through a Glass Darkly Radio. And I want to welcome everyone and just say that you're listening to United Public Radio. So today, the what was on the schedule was to interview Terry Lovelace, but Terry's not here yet. So uh, these things happen. He may or may not show up. So in the interim, I think we might have to start taking some questions. So let's just kind of go through everyone who's here. Good to see you, Miss Tessa Marie. Good to see you, Nox Twilight again. Yeah, the Steve Mera episode was outstanding. It was a thank goodness that Nathaniel Gillis recommended him. Um, there's some really interesting things about, particularly the skull experiments, which was a detailed series of experiments that they did in the UK. I don't know if it went all the way back to the 1970s, but I know at least it ended in the 1990s. And we can definitely go into that. Yeah, yeah. I kind of looked at the email correspondence. He definitely had the right date and time, but I don't know if Terry saw it. Well, he hasn't. He's not. Terry's not on yet, so I don't know if he's going to be here or not. So we're just going to start asking. Kind of going through questions. Oh boy. Let's see. Hi, Dave Jenkins. Good to see you. From England, from the UK. Well, yeah, you said England. Okay. UK is much more encompassing than that. Yes, Nathaniel Gillis is a demonologist that I've had on my show Through a Glass Darkly, and he is absolutely amazing. I think he got the dates screwed up. I don't think this is like any snub or anything like that. I think if I look at the email, it said something about like Monday, like February 29th. But if you look at the calendar this year, there is no Monday, February 29th. But my correspondence was very clearly said Sunday, the 25th. The calendar invite at Sunday the 25th. I sent the link about three times. So if he's not looking at his email right now, but these things do happen. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the missing 411. There's like places that typically have El Diablo, or they have like devil in their names is typically, but I guess over the years, people who have been associated with those areas have there's typically more disappearances in those areas. So maybe those areas are named because of the disappearances, or who knows. All right. Well, since Terry is not here yet. Oh man, I'm sorry, the juggler's assistant. My guest hasn't isn't here, so I don't know if he's going to show up or not. So you're going to see me. Have I had any Men in Black encounters? No, I have never ever had any Men in Black encounters. I think my reaction would be a little different than the normal reaction. I don't respond to threats very rationally. So, all right. Well, one thing we can talk about, or two things we can talk about, is I've recently. I don't read like a single book at a time. I read many books simultaneously. I don't know why, but I just do. And two that I'm kind of pretty deep in, well, actually three, because I'm kind of in the middle of reading Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée. I'm also reading Operation Trojan Horse by John Keel, And I'm also reading The Day After Roswell. Sitting here looking at the book titles by Colonel Philip J. Corso. And they're all pretty interesting. And I think the reason that it makes sense to read these books kind of in parallel is because you can draw distinctions or connections between or among the three books that you genuinely or generally would not likely draw context to. So the interesting thing, I think John Keel's aspect of the phenomenon, which is kind of what we folks who study UFOs, cryptids, the paranormal, if you've all watched that Steve Mera episode on Through a Glass Darkly, my YouTube channel, there seems to be some connection among all these things. That's not to say that there aren't ETs or there aren't interdimensional beings. Maybe there's all of the above. But there's a greater reality that we don't see that tends to not be acknowledged. So, oh yeah. Okay, yeah. So Anthony Jones is referring to the Jesse Mitchell's documentary that dropped about Townsend Brown, which is about anti-gravity, and it's kind of an experimental physicist who put that together and called out the guy I never publicly call out, and I'm not going to do it again either. But I didn't know that individual wrote a book, but he was definitely called out by name in Bledsoe's book UFO of God. So let's see. Uh, yeah, there's like lots of weird stuff. Lots of weird stuff. Actually, so last week I interviewed Edward Reardon, and this is that week I just kind of woke up and there was just kind of a name in my head, and the name was Andrea Puharich. And it's a name I heard before, so it wasn't like random. It wasn't a random name that just came out of nowhere. But for some reason, it was just in my head. And again, this is just all, just take this as I'm not saying any of this is significant. It could just be complete randomness. But if you look up that name in the UFO lore, he is quite an interesting figure. So he was associated with, if you've ever heard of these books, these channel books called The Law of One, kind of with this Ra entity and all sorts of crazy stuff. It's just weird. And he's associated with something called the Council of Nine, which is a group of people who, allegedly, again, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors and disinformation and misinformation. So I haven't done any due diligence on this at all. So take this all with a grain of salt, but it's just interesting. But he's associated with a group called the Council of Nine, which are apparently a group of 9 plutocrats, apparently in the United States. This might be in the book Sinister Forces by Peter Levenda. You'll have to double check. But they're all associated with like weird things like the assassination of Kennedy and, but apparently they were communicating with a group of 9 entities, call them extraterrestrials or not, right? But they called themselves the Council of Nine. So when I spoke with Ed Reardon afterwards, and I told him about this Puharich thing, he's just like, "Oh my God, I have his book," and he pulled out this book that he had of this guy, and he's just like, "I had the dream where a guy stepped out of a truck and said something about the Council of Nine." And that's it. That's all. That's all. But it's just wacky, like strange. There's a lot of that kind of going around right now. So it is weird. And yeah, again, I'm not. It's just like these weird synchronicities. It could probably mean absolutely nothing, but I've definitely had a lot of that happening. I mean, you all know about the owl in the backyard, right? Where I kind of walked up to it, took 1,000 photos, and I mean, if you look at my if you look at my, just go to my merch site, the Marvin the Owl, that's literally the owl that showed up in my backyard that I took 1,000 photos of, and just put on a t-shirt or whatever. So you can see the picture of him there. You can also see at the end of my videos, when I have like that like 5-minute infomercial that everybody should absolutely skip. You'll see the picture of that owl in a video too, because I took some video. But I was able to get within 5 feet of that owl, and any more I probably would have flown away. But it was just very weird. I've never seen a great horned owl in person that close in my entire life. So there's just stuff like that it's just I live kind of up against a park, so it could just be that. Right? There's perfectly plausible explanations to everything. Oh yeah, yeah. Uri Geller. That's a good point. The juggler's assistant. Uri Geller supposedly had a dream of this Council of Nine, and that's when he started doing all this strange. At least he claims. So Puharovich worked with Uri Geller. Like there was some connection there, but he also I think has some connection to MK Ultra, and he's a really weird, mysterious figure. So it's just a weird thing to pop into your head for no apparent reason, and then Ed Reardon has some other connection related to it. Anyway, I'm going to go back to the books because I don't want to make this about me because it's a little. Yeah, I don't think Terry's going to join us. For folks who are joining for Terry Lovelace, I think there was probably a mix-up on the timing of all this. So, after this is done, I'm going to change the thumbnail and then just rebrand this so that people aren't led astray. Because I'm not a fan of false advertising, and this is not false advertising, but it's just sometimes these things happen, and it's good that it happened because I need to be able to. Oh no, it's live now. It's just for the replay. I'm just going to change the thumbnail so that people don't. It's not false advertising. I legitimately had planned for him to be here today, but unless he looks at his calendar invite, he's probably not going to show up. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to read this out loud just for folks on the radio who won't necessarily hear this. So I'm not going to say this guy's name. Tyler Durden, who is the figure that's features prominently in both Bledsoe's book and now I'm like the name is Dr. Diana Walsh-Pasulka's 2 books, who is an intelligence figure. He supposedly confirmed to Bledsoe that Mars was originally inhabited by Bigfoot creatures that destroyed themselves. WTF is that about? I have never heard that, and I have no idea what that is about. But I definitely like to know more. Let's see. No, this is, it's tonight. I mean, I could probably schedule him for a future episode, but I think it was just signals crossed on this one. So yeah, Miss Therese Tessa Marie I've only heard owls hooting and screeching around here and flying around, of course, but I've never seen one that close. Yeah, I mean, I have photos. I'm not going to dig them out for this because it doesn't, folks on a radio. So Cynthia Batista says, I had a terrifying incident at Devil's Den a few years ago. Changed my life. Yeah, the thing that Terry tells about this, the story that he tells about this is there's this place in the middle of rural Arkansas. It's kind of in a state park, but it's like a National Bureau of Land Management owns it. So it's like federal property. And it's in the middle of nowhere. It's hard to find, but it's like this flat top hill, basically. And someone routinely mows it, like keeps it flat, even though it's in the middle of nowhere. And for what? And it was at this spot that Terry and his friend went camping in 1979, I believe, and they were abducted. So again, for folks just joining, my apologies. Terry is not here yet. I don't think he's going to be here. I think he just It was a scheduling snafu is my guess. He has the link, but I don't. It just depends if he's um, near his computer and decides to check. So these things happen. So let's see. Yeah. AGI, why does it seem AGI and UFO disclosures seem to have a weird correlation? Yeah, I don't know. It seemed to happen the last time there were a ton of uh, UFO overflights and things like that. Like all that madness started was right after we detonated an atomic weapon. So it could just be that these things show up, whatever they are, during periods of when there's kind of punctuated equilibrium with the human species, right? So like rapid leaps in evolution, things like that, or technical progress. It could be something related to that, but I don't know. It's just, let's see. Okay. All right. All right. So going back to those two books, so Keel's book was relatively interesting because he goes through a whole period of the kind of 19 or the 1890s with the like the airship sort of incidents. And it was really bizarre because whatever was flying in the skies wanted people to think that they had technology that was just a tiny bit more advanced. So they were, flying these steamships and things like that, but they didn't quite make sense, right? They were just kind of just a little bit beyond, and they were trying to make sure that people knew they were here, and they would stop. There were plenty of incidents with these things, and they kind of just went away. And then, when you saw them in the 1940s, they obviously acquired this saucer shape after the Kenneth Arnold sightings in, I don't know if it was 1947 or 1946, something like that. At the same time, you have all this weird, you have kind of like the, I don't know if it's the Babylon working or something like that, uh, that Parsons did in the Mojave Desert at the time. He's associated with Crowley and also with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech. So there's a lot of weird stuff like that. So let's see. So there was that in this Operation Trojan Horse. In terms of the day after Roswell, there's also a lot of interesting material there. I mean, that primarily concerns itself with an historical figure, the author of the book, who is Colonel Corso, and he claims to have been associated working for General Trudeau in kind of R&D, and his responsibility was to seed a lot of the technical materials that they had recovered at Roswell. And as a result of that, he talks about some of the programs that they, had acquired or had started, and how they would seed this material into the private sector. And the reason they were doing that, at least according to Corso, is that apparently the CIA and the KGB at the time were very close. So, they would kind of share everything with each other in a kind of weird, there are different overlapping, if you have a Venn diagram of affinity groups, right? Intelligence professionals are kind of in their own affinity group. And according to Corso, they felt kind of more akin to one another than they did to kind of the rest of the military industrial complex. So they would share things that they probably shouldn't have. So he was an army officer, and he was trying to keep the materials as close to the vest as possible. And as a result of that, they had to kind of come up with this elaborate scheme to seed these technologies into the private sector without the private sector knowing it. So as an example, they talk about these night vision goggles. And I know Michelle, he is awesome, but I think signals got crossed because he's not here. So I'm assuming that he probably thinks it's tomorrow night. But he does have the link and all that good stuff. So if he discovers it between now and the end of the show, he will be here. So yep, these things happen. So that's why we have a plan B. And the plan B is I'm talking about these three important researchers in kind of UFO lore, and again Colonel Philip J. Corso, John Keel, and Jacques Vallée, and we're talking about three different books. So the Day After Roswell, Operation Trojan Horse, and Passport to Magonia. So, and for folks who are just joining, Terry couldn't make it tonight. Hopefully we'll get him on in a future episode, but we're discussing that topic in lieu of that, and also taking questions if folks have anything that they want to add. So anyway, so with Corso, he's trying to seed these technologies, allegedly, according to what he wrote in the book, and it all stems from the Roswell crash. So according to his book, and I'm not talking about the lore, there were two craft that came down over kind of Roswell, kind of near Corona, and the Army, and it was near the 509th Bomber Wing, and it was the only military unit. All the nuclear weapons in the world were at this site at the time. So there was intense UFO activity, surveilling the area and things like that. And by the way, Corso's view, at least so far, I haven't finished it, tends to be that these beings are not the space brothers we think they are. It's kind of a persistent surveillance process. And as a military intelligence officer, he had to assume the worst and assume that whoever these beings were, they were surveilling highly sensitive sites and could be constituted a threat. So again, point of the military intelligence is to assume the worst possible case, prepare for it, and then if it happens to not be true, then it's all aces and it's great. But that's kind of the mindset. And at the same time, it was at the very end of World War II. We had just fought an enormously destructive war where upwards of 50 million people died, the majority of which happened kind of in the Eastern Front between the Russians and the Germans. Also, enormous loss of life in China with in Manchuria, Nanking, all that, where the Japanese were. So the last thing that the United States government needed was to Johnny Yuma is saying the narrative going around is the truth is very dark regarding the others. Yeah, I mean, my personal view is, as above, so below, or as and I think that's probably the way reality is. There's probably stuff out there that has our interests in line with their interests, and there's some that have interests that might be opposed to our interests, and then there might be some that don't care, that want to have nothing to do with us. Yeah, Free Spirit Farm or Whiteman Air Force Base is where he was stationed. And that's Terry. That's absolutely. And it says that your dad had an experience at your farm not far from there. Interesting. Yeah, say more. I'd like to. I can read it to folks. For folks who are just joining, Terry couldn't make it tonight, so I'm discussing kind of the work of three different authors in the field of UFOs, and that's Colonel Corso, Jacques Vallée, and John Keel. So, and we're talking about Corso. So anyway, Roswell, according to Corso, indeed happened. We recovered some craft. There was actually one of the beings that was on the ground, kind of started running away, and one of the MPs that showed up on the scene, or one of the military folks who showed up the scene, like shot him, like there's shot this being in the back. So it was a different time. These people had just, most of these men and women had just returned from fighting a war for 4 years, where it was no quarter either on the against the Germans or against the Japanese. So they weren't in the mood to like assume that these things surveilling the only nuclear weapon stockpile on the planet, were friendly. Ian, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I appreciate the support. So what happened is they took all these materials, and kind of by way, there's various locations. Obviously, you all know that initially there was a report that we had recovered a flying saucer in Roswell, and then it was amended, and subsequently it was kind of at high altitude balloons as part of Project Mogul or something like that, and that was the cover story. Incidentally, there was a telegram in the famous picture where I can't remember the gentleman's name, but the military intelligence professional who was in charge of this operation was kind of kneeling before this balloon wreckage and had a telegram in his hand. And apparently the original photographer supplied the prints to somebody, and they were able to use AI to see what was actually on that telegram. And it had something about, send the flying saucer to Wright-Patterson Airfield, etc. So it was a cover story. I mean, it was almost certainly a cover story. Now, there are a bunch of alternative cover stories involved in this, but a lot of them are just silly. I think the Air Force tried to debunk it twice. The second time, the debunk that they used failed because they claimed that the bodies were crash test dummies, but at the time they didn't have crash test dummies. So like really, really bad rookie mistakes. But anyway, where Corso comes in is he spent a lot of time in Italy during World War II. I think came back, was stationed at Fort Leavenworth, and much of this material was routed through Fort Leavenworth on its way to Wright-Patterson Airfield in Ohio. And there was a night when he had kind of staff duty, when he had to kind of just go around and check the post and make sure nothing was on fire and no one was in trouble. And he had to go check building to building. And in one of these occasions, one of his sergeants was kind of pale, kind of like looked at him ashen and was kind of terrified. And he said, well, like, what's the deal? He's like, sir, you have to see this. So he pulls him into this warehouse, and there's a crate. They open the crate, and there's just like a being in fluid, like embalming fluid or some strange like fluid to help preserve some of these bodies. And that's the first time that Corso claims that he saw one of these entities. And he just kind of just shut his mouth, didn't say anything. Now, the other thing you have to keep in mind is when someone from military intelligence writes a tell-all book like this, some of the information is probably going to be deliberate misinformation or disinformation. So you have to take a lot of it with a grain of salt. Is that story true? Did that really happen? I don't know. But I think that's, from what I've read so far, seems to be a little bit more fanciful than some of the other information. So anyway, he later on, about a decade later, he's in Washington, D.C., working with this guy, General Trudeau, who sends this cart of materials to his office. Doesn't say what's in it. He just says, I want you to take a look at this stuff. And it's basically wreckage from the Roswell crash. And a lot of it had made its way throughout all the military industrial complex. And this is just specifically the stuff that had arrived into the Army's hands. And it was that kind of environment where they couldn't tell anybody that they had it. They couldn't. So it was literally just Corso and Trudeau who would talk about it, and nobody else. Nobody else was involved. And Corso's mission was to draw up a strategy for how to get these materials into private companies' hands without them knowing that of the provenance of this material, right? So it's just like, hey, we got this advanced technology from a foreign adversary, and we want to see if you can get anything from it. So the first part that he had to do is he had to look at people who were associated with the Manhattan Project, like Dr. Sarbacher and von Braun, or not necessarily just the Manhattan Project, but also the U.S. rocketry program. So folks like von Braun, who were obviously originally German scientists who were brought over as part of Operation Paperclip, and so he had to find these folks, and they were kind of the conduits for getting this stuff into the private sector's hands. Because again, the military couldn't work on it because the military worked on it. Then the Soviets would know about it, and the CIA couldn't learn about it because the CIA learned about it. They would share it with the KGB, et cetera, according to Corso. Okay, so if anybody out there in the CIA is getting upset that I'm making them look bad, I'm just repeating what Corso is saying. It could be complete misinformation. I acknowledge that. So what ends up happening is, I think the first person he seeds it with, there was like a lens that they found. And again, Corso has to look through each of these materials and kind of intuit what the purpose of some of it is. And it's not 100% straightforward. So he finds something that kind of looks like an advanced circuit board. That one, I would think that something. It looks like the way he described it was like him describing a circuit board from like 1995, right? Like right now, there are chips you can't even really see the transistors because there's millions upon millions in different substrates built, in three-dimensionally on top of one another, and you could probably see the stuff with microscope and things like that, but it's not like the tech described seemed like 1990s tech, at least some of it, at least the kind of the integrated circuit side. So one of the things he gets that's pretty obvious is this looks like a lens. He puts the lens in front of his eyes at night. He can see at night, right? So it's a precursor to night vision. So he takes this material, he scours the R&D establishment for anybody who's working on night vision. And apparently the Germans had been working on it in World War II, but it was much cruder than than the materials that they had, that Corso had from the crash. So he found a scientist who was working on it, who was one of these Sarbacher von Braun types, went kind of read him in on this and just said, I was never here. And it was also super cloaking. Like he was at Fort Belvoir, but he couldn't show up in his military uniform. He just showed up in a suit and tie, as if that would, if somebody was watching where he was going, as if that would prevent them from saying, oh, that's Colonel Corso. He's just in the suit and tie. Why, at an army post, why doesn't he just wear his uniform? That's kind of weird. Maybe there's a reason that we should start paying attention. But anyway, he takes it there he scours the R&D programs, and anything that is working on something similar to what he intuits is part of this technology, then the plan is for him to pay them a visit, grant them the technology, just give it to them, no paperwork, and then just walk away. And then hopefully at some point in the future, there would be some level of development. And some of the areas that, at least he claims in his book, where they developed some of these technologies, where they worked on, is, night vision was one, fiber optics, I believe Kevlar might have been something. So, different fibers. I don't recall if you talked about anything about the memory metal, the metal that you kind of crumble up and then it just restores its original form. But there are other programs. I think there was something called Project Horizon, where they were going to potentially use some of this, which was a plan to build an like a base on the moon. And kind of it was planned for mid 1960s, and there was a lot of the excuse me, a lot of the programs that they worked on were dual purpose. So part of it was to focus on the Soviet threat, of course, and then the secondary purpose of it was, so for instance, satellites. They were uh, both, yeah, fiber optic. So Anthony Jones is saying fiber optics is 99.99% re-engineered alien tech. I mean, according to Corso, that sounds consistent. So some of the other tech, so they were working on kind of dual purpose tech. So you take satellites, for instance. Not only are you monitoring positions on Earth, but you're also rotating around and kind of looking for threats outward. You're also looking for potential sites of interest where non-human intelligences may be operating or using bases and things like that. That was so initially, according to Corso, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force were all trying to work on space, and the Russians were more unified, whereas we were competing against each other. So they got Sputnik up into space a lot faster, and they were just kind of beating the crap out of us in the space race. So allegedly, according to Corso, Eisenhower spun up NASA and wanted to put it in civilian hands so they could concentrate all the effort R&D in one place where there was this, you could focus on trying to beat the Soviets at their own game. So as part of this, there was a program called Project Corona, and I think there was some piece of tech or satellite called Discovery, and they covertly included Corona in this launch. And the purpose of Corona was kind of a satellite system to observe what was going on planet Earth. So there was a lot of effort to not only surveil Soviet assets, but also any assets that might be on Soviet territory that were associated with this potential NHI threat. And at the same time, while that was happening, we were also sharing any intelligence that we gained about potential NHI bases and things like that on Soviet territory to the Soviets. So it was kind of a weird thing because there were also divisions within the Soviet Union. So the Soviet military hated the Soviet commissars and the Communist Party establishment. Like, they just wanted to do their jobs and protect their country against all threats. So the way that they did this is they would share the intelligence with the Soviet military establishment, and the Soviet military establishment would keep it to themselves and not share it with the communists. So there's a lot of weird bi-directional activity. It's not black and white where we keep all secrets to ourselves. There was this weird cloak and dagger thing going on where us and the Soviets tacitly knew that there was a potential threat outside, off of the planet. And by the way, this is very explicit in the Corso book that it's kind of an extraterrestrial sort of threat. I'm not saying that's necessarily what it is, but that was his working assumption during the period of the book, at least where I am at the current point in time. So there's a lot of this cloak and dagger stuff that's going on during the course or during the period that they were looking at. But anyway, there were other technologies that they were looking at, like getting a base on the moon, primarily to defend against a threat from space. And it could be, from the Russians just dropping rods from God, which is kind of what we currently have, which is these like tungsten steel rods that the kinetic effect is so powerful that you don't really need nukes. They just kind of they drop them from space, and the kinetic energy is of sufficient force to eliminate whatever target you're trying to take out. So again, the Russians and the Americans would tacitly cooperate in private. And that was part of the thing with Corona. They didn't, the Soviet and American military both acknowledged its existence, even though these things were looking and observing what was going on Soviet territory. They were tacitly okay with it because we were sharing the intelligence that if there were any NHIs landing or going. Moonanites. I don't know what Moonanites are, Philip, but I don't. Who knows? But regardless, that's kind of where I am so far in the book. What was astonishing to me is that we were working on a moon base. Like it's called Operation or Project Horizon, and they planned to have 12 personnel on the moon at all times. And there was, as part of the Cold War, we were worried the Soviets were going to get there first. And if they got there first and claimed the moon as their territory, would it constitute an attack if we landed and tried to establish a similar base? So there was a huge rush to get there before they did. Now, I don't know what happened after that. I have to read a little bit further, but it's some fascinating stuff. And why we're not there now, or at least as far as I know. I mean, who knows whether or not we have. It doesn't mean we don't have some classified facilities up there. I doubt it, but you never know. Right? You never know. So that's kind of the day after Roswell. The other one, Operation Trojan Horse, is different in the sense that it doesn't accept as a central philosophy that these things are coming from, or definitely extraterrestrials. It's kind of more of a phenomenological sort of approach, as is, by the way, Passport to Magonia, which is Jacques Vallée's work. So, by the way, if folks are just joining us now, you are listening to United Public Radio, and the show is Through a Glass Darkly Through a Glass Darkly Radio with Sean Patrick Hazlett. Unfortunately, my guest was unable to make it tonight, so we are discussing three kind of landmark works on the phenomenon. And that's The Day After Roswell by Corso, Operation Trojan Horse by John Keel, as well as Passports to Magonia by Jacques Vallée. So in Keel's book, he actually does some really interesting. We're gonna go back to the moonities. Like communities. I'll ask him. I'll try to get him on kind of not next week. Lynn Buchanan's going to be on next week. And I've done this with Lynn Buchanan before, so I know he'll be there. But maybe the week after, I'll try to wrangle Terry in again. But I think it was just kind of a scheduling thing. But anyway, one of the interesting things that John Keel says in his, in Operation Trojan Horse, which is kind of interesting. So what he did is he had a subscription, or he monitored very closely all the local news articles. Now, the reason that's important is that it's much more difficult for, kind of like an Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA infiltrates national media and, excuse me, and is able to kind of blacklist or kill any strange reports about UFOs and things like that. Whereas local communities, and the journalistic standards are probably were a little bit lower back then for local papers versus national papers. Now I'd probably say the opposite is probably true, given that there's far fewer local papers, and the national news media basically just doesn't question anything. They kind of just report what they're told. So you can't really follow national news media and expect to know what's really going on in the world. You have to use as many sources as you can to figure out what the actual reality is. Although you can learn a lot by what they don't report, because that's usually something that whoever's in charge doesn't want you to know about. That's kind of primarily what they're useful for. It's like the bombers that returned, the B-29 bombers that returned from bombing missions, right? We didn't look at where the holes were on the bombers that returned. We looked at where the holes weren't, because the places where there weren't holes means that no bombers that had holes in those locations survived. So those were the places that needed to be up armored and protected, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. So the interesting thing that Keel did is he took all these local news reports from various papers, and he created kind of a database of when these incidents occurred, where they occurred, when they were the most common, what day of the week, and things like that. And unfortunately, it kind of plays into Corso's thesis a little bit. And by that, I mean, you would think that the most common time of day that you would see a UFO, right, would be on like a Saturday night or like a Friday night when everybody's out and about. They're looking up at the sky. They're seeing a lot of stuff. You would have all else being equal too, even if they were uniformly distributed throughout the week, right? People would probably report more sightings on Friday nights and Saturday nights. And in Keel's data set, that was not the case. Curiously, the case was they were most often encountered on Wednesday evenings, which is basically the last time people are looking up in the sky. The other thing that was very common is you would also expect a much greater number of sightings over densely populated areas, simply because of observer bias, right? You have more sensors, you have more people in those areas. And Keel's data set indicated the opposite. Most of these sightings were in rural communities where there weren't a lot of people around. So if you're trying not to be observed, and you're probably up to no good, or you're up to something that you don't want people to know. I don't know if that means, they could be scientists observing the human race and they don't want to interfere with their experiment by being observed, right? It could be something that innocuous. So I don't want to throw people off. But if you don't want to be observed, you would fly around on Wednesday nights when nobody's looking up and it's the middle of the work week, and you would fly around in rural environments. Now, this is Keel's data set. There are other data sets that are a little bit more nuanced. The other thing, and I don't necessarily know if this is in Keel's data, but if you look at just the general literature, there's also a very high correlation with location between location and nuclear facilities, right? There's a huge number there. I got a good question. So, didn't Keel do propaganda for the Allies during World War II? So it was his job to analyze and understand media coverage versus facts on the ground. Something like this. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to check and double check. I don't want to kind of speak out of school on that, but his work is pretty impressive. But he seems to kind of be of the mind that whatever this phenomena is, it's not necessarily ET, right? It could be transdimensional. It could be any number of things. And I think if you actually do a serious analysis of the data, I think you probably fall into one of two categories. The first is we live in a simulation and things can be anything they want to be, and this is just the simulation giving people what they want to see. Or B, we live in what they would call in the 1940s a Buck Rogers universe, right? Where you have all sorts of like various phenomena and things like that. So I mean, look, I've interviewed tons of people who've been in rooms where there's been like demonic possession. They've been had experiences with UFOs, remote viewing. Like our government did do that, right? Which is the ability to run intelligence operations on various, observe Soviet facilities from a desk in Fort Meade, Maryland, using a technique called remote viewing, where you can see in space distantly in space and time. So, I'm not familiar with the Looney Tunes take on Buck Rogers, but I'll have to take a look. Anyway, uh, it feels like it's one of those two. So you take things like the skull experiments that I talked about briefly at the very beginning of this. There was a group in the place called Skull in the UK, and they kind of did seances for a few years. And yeah, it was probably an extremely long period. It was maybe 10 to 20 years. And over time, they were able to get this phenomena to do really strange things that defied physics. So as an example, when they were pretty far along, they would ask these entities to take pictures. And it started first where they would be in a dark room and these things would just start snapping photos. Nobody was there, and they had scientists that would observe the experiment and try to do this. And then they would start removing things from the camera so that the camera just wouldn't work naturally, just wouldn't work mechanically. And to the point where they kind of went there with sealed film, like 35 millimeter film. And there would be somebody there who would, verify that this was like factory sealed, never been opened. And they would ask these entities to, take pictures. So they would unspool the film that, factory sealed, never has never been opened. And, they would find all sorts of pictures on this stuff. So it was very, very odd. And then they kind of kept doing this, and they started experiencing apports, right, which are these, items basically appearing out of nowhere. And you could argue that the photos are an example of this apport phenomena, but they kind of did this over and over and over again, and then they kind of lost control of the experiment. Like thousands of whatever these things were started coming through. They started and they would capture some of this stuff on film. They captured these. They called this guy Mr. Blue or this entity Mr. Blue, and it looked like a gray, but it was like just kind of a blue color. Kind of looked like an apparition that they caught on camera, and they caught a lot of this stuff on camera. Throughout this experimental period. So it was kind of interesting times. So there again, I'm talking to Stephen Mera, who's a parapsychologist or researcher in the UK. He was present for these things, and he kind of documented these things. There's also, the categorization of poltergeists. There's also physical poltergeists. So this is the kind of the dogmen sort of activity. And, as folks have already mentioned on kind of the first part of this radio show, is that sometimes when you start looking into these things, sometimes when you stare into the abyss stares back. And he has numerous examples of really weird paranormal things would happen to him if he if he was moving in the right direction, it would be all aces. Like all paths would open, everything would be great. But if he started sticking his nose into a place where whatever this phenomenon is that didn't want him to look, they would push back. And there'd be some there's some creepy stories about that. And the latest thing that he was looking into where it pushed back is he was doing some research on Sumerian and also Babylonian demonology, and it was associated with these physical poltergeist, kind of this dogman entities in England. There's a spot in England apparently where people will be chased by these supposed dogmen that are like physical poltergeists, but the moment they stop or they freeze, it kind of just feeds on fear. It'll just kind of turn around and go away. So anyway, whatever this is, it's real, but I don't think we understand enough about the nature, the full spectrum and nature of reality to truly have a good sense of what the heck is going on. Yeah, Johnny Yuma, I think so too. Keel was ahead of time, but you know who was even more ahead of Keel? That was Charles Fort. So when you hear like the term Fordian, right, that's where it comes from. Like that guy, I think, had a pretty good sense of how complex all this stuff is. That's right. So that's roughly where I am in the Keel material. The other place that I also talked about passports to Magonia, and kind of similar to similar to Keel, where Jacques Vallée looks at a bunch of European cases, a lot of American cases, and there's a high strangeness factor to all these things, right? Part of it is, let's say that, let's assume it's all nuts and bolts, right? But if we were trying to take over a planet somewhere, 10,000 years in the future, one way to get people to not share that we were there would be to show them absurd stuff, right? Like dogmen in tweed jackets smoking cigars, right? Which is what someone reported at Skinwalker Ranch as an example. So, there's a lot of that stuff in the literature, and that Vallée looks at. He also looks at stories of fairy lore and all that sort of stuff to try to correlate. Is this the same thing? Is it are these things just bleeding through from other realities? All this stuff is a lot more complicated, and it could just be the reason that we don't have disclosure is the government probably doesn't have, has some idea, but doesn't have a really good story. Interesting. So Philip Blair is recommending a book called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by Walter Evans Wentz. And it was published in 1911, but he claims it's another book ahead of its time. So, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff associated with the Fae, or the She is another, group of quote unquote entities in Ireland that people talk about. I myself have not delved too much into those topics, but it's still fascinating. I think you talk to people in Ireland, and by the way, yeah, that includes UFO. That book includes UFO accounts. So, like you see orbs, you take kind of the Bledsoe case, right? Oh man, yeah, Philip K. Dick was. Look, I know people who were personal friends with him. I've actually interviewed them on my channel, and he was a strange dude, but he was very into the I Ching, right? Which is it's like a 64 character Chinese system, and that you use for kind of predicting things. He was very much into it, and he would sometimes use it to plot his books or to write his books. And there were often times, and he would also use it because he had a lot of he kind of had an affinity for crazy women. So he would ask this thing for relationship advice. And it wasn't like self-reinforcing. Like it would give him, if the answer was bad, it would tell him the bad answer. And apparently when he got a bad answer from the I Ching, he would quote unquote make it sleep outside because he was so upset with it. But Philip K. Dick was Very interesting character. He was very much ahead of his time. Um, I'm trying to remember the author that I interviewed. Um, yeah, it's not coming to me. It's Tim something, but he wrote like the Pirates of the book that was behind the Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Ties, and um, stuff like that. And he's still around. He's a good. Oh, Tim Powers. Tim Powers. Just check out the Tim Powers interview. There's multiple interviews, but you'll see. I think it's got like Philip K. Dick's face on the thumbnail. So definitely check that out. Oh, I didn't know that. So Philip K. Dick's last wife has a YouTube channel. She talks about her writing projects for cats, local life, where she lives down in California. Tessa's her name apparently. I'll have to check that out. That's interesting. Yeah, if you could put a link, Philip, in the comments so that people could find that channel, that's totally appropriate. I think that would be great. Um, yeah, so I think I've wrung out all the stories that I know just now, but there are several books that I definitely want to read. So like the Lavenda's Sinister Forces series is something that I want to get into. He's also somebody I would love to interview. He's got really fascinating. He just follows all these breadcrumbs, right? Even though Europeans got to the United States relatively recently, North America is a very old continent. And there's a lot of things that have happened on North America. And I think people aren't aware that their surroundings. Yeah, so Moonman, I know you're joining us late, but Terry's not joining us tonight. I'm going to have to change the thumbnail after this thing's over so that people aren't led astray. But my guess is it was a scheduling snafu of some sort or something. Eventually, I might be able to, I'll ask him to come back on a future episode because I don't think he's even aware. He has the link and all that stuff, but I think he thought the interview was tomorrow night for some reason. Who knows? Let me see. I don't think I've gotten anything from him. Yeah, so he's probably not even checking email right now. Let's see. Yeah, Moonman, I'm freestyling tonight. I'm freestyling on the radio. I just like summarized 3 books. Peter Lavenda. Yeah, Peter Lavenda has absolutely followed some very interesting trails. Yeah, I've reached out to him. I just haven't heard from him. So I would definitely, if anybody has contact with him, I would love to. I would love to interview him. So, all right. Well, kind of filled up a lot of time so far, but what do folks want to hear about? There's a lot of kind of crazy stuff going on in UFO land, right? First we're getting disclosure, then we're not getting disclosure. Mike Turner, 1 week starts talking about some dangerous destabilizing technology that should be disclosed immediately to the American people. And then suddenly he goes quiet. There's, a bunch of missile launches are hastily scheduled and then unscheduled and just weird. So a lot of weird stuff going on. But in terms of the U.S. government, the sense I get is I don't think the U.S. government has a good. I think the phenomenon is so complex and so complicated that I just don't think. I mean, like they can't even run FEMA properly, right? So like trying to put something out that's this nuanced is probably beyond their capability. Yeah. In terms of have I experienced anything mysterious firsthand. Nothing that like beats me over the head and I say that's like anomalous. Most of it is just weird synchronicities, like the one I talked about at the very beginning. But again, all that stuff could just be, just by chance. Um, yeah, so Philip's asking, was a mysterious technology about Russia's nuclear-powered satellites? I think so, but who knows? Yeah, they're like talking about shooting balloons now and stuff like that. That was all interesting. The China balloon flap, where they now call balloons UAPs, so that they can confuse people and obscure other things in our skies. But in terms of like anomalous things happening to me, the only things are strange animal stuff, right? We talked about the owl, right? That just showed up in my backyard. I kind of was able to walk up to it within 5 feet. I literally took 1,000 photos, so I'm not making it up. You can also run really weird experiments, right? So here's an example. If you're trying to make a decision between two things, right? You can ask a question like, I don't know. Let's say you just got into two colleges and you say, should I go to college A or college B, right? And then you just kind of, pray to whomever you pray to, God, Allah, whatever. And say something like, if A, show me a hawk. If B, show me a raven, right? And I did something like that a few weeks ago. And within 5 minutes, literally within 5 minutes, a raven, probably 6 foot wingspan, came flying like right over my head. And it was just like visibly like squawking at me. Again, could that randomly happen? Right? Is there a probability that would randomly happen, regardless of what I did? Yeah, of course. Which is why the sort of things that happen to me are, they're not black and white, right? So you have to ground yourself in some of this stuff too. So as an example, one thing I did to ground myself is I just kind of recorded 2 episodes with Mick West, who is a famous UFO debunker. And the reason I wanted to do that is I wanted my audience to have an understanding of what possible natural explanations of things that they see in the sky could be. And one of the things that I thought was pretty fascinating was, I love the Raven, Philip, was that you have an increasing number of Starlink satellites in the sky, but they're doing, they're crossing on kind of intersecting or almost intersecting elliptical orbits and stuff like that makes it appear like something zigzagging in the sky, but it's really like 2 or 3 Starlink satellites moving in opposite directions. And as a result, the reports of UFOs are exploding among pilots. But a huge percentage of them are these Starlink satellites. And it's not like the usual train that most people know of, where you have like, three lights in the sky and they kind of just go across the sky and disappear. It's more complex than that. So pilots are starting to report all this stuff. So they have to. The airline companies are bringing in people to explain that, like, no, a lot of like most of the time it's going to be these Starlink satellites that are doing this stuff. So anyway, you just have to remain grounded and try to find alternative explanations so that you don't go kind of, everything's a sign. You also have to be aware of observer bias, confirmation bias, attention bias, and all those things. And like attention bias, for instance, when you buy a new car, right? You ever have that experience when you buy a new car that you see that car suddenly everywhere? Everybody's got it now. And that's only because your attention is on that car, and now you happen to be noticing all, other cars of that type. So you have to reconcile what you see with some of those cognitive biases as well. And it's not super simple, but the short answer to the question of, has anything something kind of weird happened to me. Nothing that is black and white, right? So there's the bit about with animals happens a lot. The other thing is, I would say I've had 3 or 4 precognitive dreams. Nothing significant, completely mundane stuff. But as an example, usually somebody will appear in them that is a figure that I don't know. So there's a guy who's on Skinwalker Ranch. He's a former CIA guy. He showed up in one of my dreams, just randomly. And, I won't go into the details, but this guy was in my dream. And that was, I recorded it on my community tab on YouTube. You can go and find it on Through Glass Darkly somewhere, where I just described the details of the dream. 2 days later, this guy, Danny Jones of the Danny Jones podcast, calls me because he's interviewing a guest that I had interviewed in the past. He's just getting background information. And at the end of the interview, I just randomly said, a guest that would be really interesting to have on your show is Chris Bledsoe. And he went nuts. He's like, what the heck? You're the second person today who recommended Chris Bledsoe for this. Like, what is going on? What's this with this synchronicity? And I said, well, Danny, who recommended him first? And he said, Andy Bustamante. So like little things like that you could easily explain away as attention bias. It's just weird. Right. The other one that happened recently, there was an episode on the Y-Files called "Have You Seen This Man in Your Dreams?" Okay. And 2 nights before that episode even showed up, right, was even produced, that dude was in my dreams. And it wasn't like, it was just like, hey, look at me. You see my face? Make sure you see my face. Right. It was like going out of its way, whatever it was, to show me that. So I don't think there's actually this guy who shows up in your dreams. I just think that, each of us, kind of right now we're in meat space, but I think each of us has some precognitive ability. We just don't understand it or know it. And time doesn't work the way that we think it works. So I think that was just my subconscious kind of just saying like, hey, Meatball, I'm going to show you something, right? I'm going to show you this figure in your dream, and then you're going to see it for the first time outside of your dream 2 days later, right? So again, not predictive, not useful, but it feels like for all of us, something is out there trying to show that we are more than the physical. And I think that's about as far as I can conclude anything about anything right now. So, and again, if somebody were to say, debunked, you're debunked, all that stuff is just attention bias and this and that, I would say, yeah, could be. So part of it is, unless you see something that's so unambiguous and undeniable, like I haven't had that moment yet. But I've seen weird, like this weird, like the synchronicities and the precognition, stuff like that. And I try to document it when I have a dream that feels precognitive. I'll write it down and try to figure it out. Oh, okay. So Anthony Jones, I want to get back to this. Cyber attack or sun flare? What was determined with the mass allergies the other day? Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that story just went away. I don't know. It could be either. It could just be, China or Russia just sending a shot across the bow saying that we can do this, or it could be some sort of solar flare. But let me look it up actually, because I haven't checked it. Because I think it was AT&T outage, right? Yeah, so the company's initial review. So let me make sure that we're looking at this. So this article it's USA Today, so take it with a grain of salt. This is as of February 23rd. So the company's initial review says it wasn't a cyber attack. Okay. So what was it? So AT&T and federal organizations are investigating the cause of the disruption. Yeah. Oh, it sounds like it's just human incompetence. So an initial review by the company found the disruption was caused by the quote unquote application and execution of an incorrect process used as we were expanding our network, or more simply put, a technical error. All right, well, yeah, I have. Okay, yeah, we're gonna see more of these things, but I'm not gonna say on the over the radio why. But expect a lot more of these things. Um, let's see. Yeah, so it looks like it's human error. Yeah, they don't think it was a cybersecurity incident, and there's nothing about solar flares. So, good old fashioned human error. But we're seeing a lot more of these things recently. I wonder why. I'm not going to answer that question, but I have a very strong idea why. And it's nothing. Yeah, it probably was across multiple platforms, but it could be like a third party um, supplier of some sort of technology or something like that. Yeah. So thank you, Anthony, for reminding me about that because that was um, that was interesting. I'm glad I was able to look it up. Yeah, just good old fashioned incompetence. Now, that's the other thing too. Is that really the story? Right? Like if it were like a cyber attack, would they say it was a cyber attack? If it were a solar flare and we're kind of in line for a Carrington incident, would they say it was a solar flare or a coronal mass ejection? Would they? I mean, after the pandemic, I don't believe they would. I think I think they would say operator error. Now, I'm not saying it's not an operator error. It probably is, but you can't believe anything that some of these national news organizations print anymore because they just print what they're told. And if the company's in the driver's seat, then it's probably true. But if they're not in the driver's seat, and somebody else is, I don't know. I don't know. So let's see. Yeah, so we are entering strange waters right now. I think there's another interview where Chris Bledsoe also claimed that there was going to be some sort of event in 2026, April time for or around kind of Easter. I think on my show he said September 2026, but maybe they just that's when the Red Star Regulus aligns with the eyes of the Sphinx. So it could get spicy. Yeah, yeah. Of course they would. Yeah, it wouldn't. But you know what? Like if they did say something, at least people could better prepare for something. Because if something really bad happens and they weren't prepared for it, the moment that the people in charge try to restore order, it's going to be a lot harder. Because people aren't going to trust them anymore, and they're not going to have to, right? Because weren't useless. They were usually literally useless. And if you have somebody trying to collect taxes from you that um, did not warn you about something big coming, and as a result you weren't prepared, and millions of people died, then they don't deserve to be in control anymore. So I hope they realize that. I hope they realize that. Um, but I don't. I think right now we just have a bunch of kleptocrats. I think the military is very competent, and the intelligence community is very competent. But I think the kleptocrats in charge are utterly corrupt. So yeah, we won't be. Yeah, so free spirit farmer, you're probably correct. We won't be told anything anytime. At the end of the day, I think we are as a species um, at a point when we're pushing people away Actually, I'm sorry Miss Tessa Marie is asking me, are there any more incoming interviews with Nathaniel Gillis or Steve Mera? Not with Steve, but I have Nathaniel on the books for, I think, early April. So hopefully that video will appear. Obviously, if we record it and all that stuff happens, that should, come out sometime in April. And it's on, I think he has some new research that he unveiled at a conference in Manchester, England last week. So I think he's going to cover some of that new research that he's kind of gone through. So I know it should be interesting. I'm looking forward to it. All right, what else do people have their minds on in terms of I think we're talking about how disclosure might progress. So it sounds like Congress and the Senate are continuing to have some of these classified hearings where they're learning about the nature of reality, but they're not telling anybody about it, which sounds, par for the course. So their families, just like they can trade stocks with material non-public information, totally fine for them to do it. By the way, if you could invest in the, congressional stock portfolio, you should absolutely do it. There are actually hedge funds that index against it because it's so wildly successful, right? Because, if you know that the government's going to give a $50 billion contract to Lockheed Martin, then you can invest in Lockheed Martin before the public knows. And then when the public finds out, the stock price goes up and you pocket the money, right? So it's just, we'll see. I'm just not confident that. I think we're at a point in our evolution where you're on your own. You're on your own. You got to take. Nobody's going to come and tell you what the nature of reality is. No one's going to come and kind of ease you into what's going on around the world. You are on your own. You are responsible for learning the truth on your own because no one else is going to tell you. And that's where I am personally right now. Obviously be careful and be prudent and make sure you're well grounded. And that's the thing. Like, let's say in 2026, these things show up and it turns out they're darker than we thought it was. So all the people who believe in Space Brothers are going to go out to welcome them and they're going to get their anus cord out. Right? Like, it's absurd. You got to give people a heads up. At least let them know what the nature of reality is and they can plan accordingly. Trust your own people to behave in a way where they can accept the reality of the situation rather than shaming people who go through sometimes traumatic experiences. And, it's not a great way to do things. I think he probably knows. So we got a question from Free Spirit Farmer. Would love to know what Tucker Carlson knows about UFOs, where he's not wanting to tell his wife. He probably knows about some of these human mutilations, but he also might know some of the Bledsoe stuff because he talks about how it might be spiritual and there might be, and I think there's an element of all the above. I think there's life out in the universe, right? There's trillions of planets out there, many of which support life, probably. But I also think that there might be kind of interdimensional, aspect of reality where, things are opening wormholes between, kind of universes in, if you think of, I'm trying like brain theory, right? BRANE, where universes are just kind of like floating out in this ether and sometimes they collide. And when they collide, things bleed through, again, it's a physical or a physics, theory about how reality works, but maybe that sort of thing, these collisions happen, and maybe there's some species that's figured out how to bridge these things and jump from universe to universe, and who knows. But I think what we know in terms of science and physics only scratches the surface. Yeah, so Anthony Jones is saying if Bledsoe is legit, he is the key to true disclosure. My only fear he is surrounded by people with ties to the enemy. I think I think the intelligence community, like any other community, has different factions. There's the jackass faction that wants to keep it all quiet, and kind of do the knowledge is power, and like, oh my god, there'll be a panic. It's just like, rip off the band-aid. It's been 80 years, dude. It's been 80 years. What the hell is wrong with you? And then there's the other crowds that want to kind of subtly start telling people the nature of reality. But I think that we've stunted our growth for the last 80 years by not being more open about these things. And I think along the way, many people had their entire lives traumatized and destroyed. For what? To keep a secret about reality? Reality is reality. Let people figure it out. Yeah, I don't think we'll. So Philip Blair is saying, I don't think we'll have a panic. I mean, in the United States, I don't think we will, but we would. But I think in other parts of the world that are in places where there's fundamentalist factions, let's just call it, I think of all sorts of religions, I think the reaction might be a little crazy. And then imagine the reality. Like, I can spin up. That's the problem. There's so much disinformation and misinformation. You can't even spin up a coherent narrative, being fully confident that you have all the facts, right? So imagine if there is some, let's say it's ET. Let's say there's some extraterrestrial species that's been abducting people in private, that's been subtly altering their DNA. And it could just be that that's what they do, and that's what they've always done. They've always kind of helped humanity evolve. It could also be that they want to take over the planet, and they're hybridizing the human species, and then you're just going to replace us with something, right? Who knows? We have no idea. And I'd rather have some sense, even if we don't have all the answers. Yeah, so Roger Claiborne is presenting a completely and totally legitimate hypothesis, right? Which is, he says, I suspect most of it might have been just a psyop. There literally isn't anything to disclose except secret tech. That could be true. Like, that could absolutely be true. And that's the problem. You have to be able to simultaneously accept that it could be any one of these different things until either you have direct experience, or somebody comes in and kind of gives you a much broader narrative. So Philip Blair says it's old news in Brazil. So he doubts that they would have a panic, and that's kind of the human mutilation thing, and that's typically where a lot of them happen. I think there's one case in the U.S. that I know of, which is I think it's like the Lovett case. It was like in the 1950s, where an Air Force guy was like, his body was found kind of similar to cattle mutilation, stuff like that. There's also an apocryphal story in Vietnam where American soldiers came across a bunch of Greys like loading up Vietnamese and American body parts after a battle. But again, it could be apocryphal. Who knows if it's real? I think Stringfield included it in his book. So Free Spirit Farmer said, if the aliens are smart, they would ditch this planet and zip out of here. We aren't civilized enough yet. Unless they want to just replace us, right? So, and that's the thing. We just don't know. There's no responsible adult who is sharing this information with the American public. So, like, for all I know, and I think Rush is an honest broker, and I think he believes what he's been told. But there's no guarantee that he's not been told stuff that was just cooked up as a psyop to scare the bejesus out of the Chinese, right? Where they start going crazy because we've recovered UFO technology. We allegedly recover UFO technology. Now, there's a world where they didn't recover anything, right? And they're like, oh my God, we're in trouble. But I doubt we live in that world. I think some of these stories are true. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so ubiquitous. But how do you know? You can't put your hat on it because you don't have direct experience. But the problem is when you lie to the public like this so frequently and so often, they start to question the very nature of reality. How do you know what you know to be true? Well, I know that if I touch a frying pan and burn my hand, I know from experiential knowledge that that's true, right? How do I know that an apple's going to drop if I let it go when I'm holding it and hit the ground? Well, I have experiential knowledge and a theory called gravity. But then there's other stuff that, particularly about history, that the only reason you know is because there was some document and then some historian wrote about the document and then interpreted the document and put it in writing, right? For all you know, that could have been completely doctored and written up. We have no idea. So the danger of, that's why nobody believes the news media anymore. They lied so consistently during the pandemic that, as a means or a mechanism of control for governments, they're just not effective anymore. The only thing the government can now rely on is its powers of censorship. That's it. So Anthony Jones says that he has a crazy theory on how Bledsoe story could be a psyop of a Jesus return event that leads us to a one world government. Yeah, I don't think the world is that conspiracy minded. I mean, have you seen our government? Have you seen how incompetent these politicians are? There's no way they could possibly kind of collude in an effective conspiracy like that. There's no way. They're just not competent people. They're midwits. They're not that intelligent. Okay, so Miss Tessa Marie, do you think there's anything to Rh negative, O negative blood types being linked to aliens or something weird? That's what mine is. Only like 8 to 12% of the world population has it. So, Joe Montaldo, the guy who owns the station, actually, he has done a study where he has, thousands, if not tens of thousands, of contactee reports. And one of the commonalities is, I think, and this is something I think he said on Coast to Coast AM. So something like 69% of people in those contactee or experiencer reports had Rh negative blood types. There was also a high percentage of, higher than average IQ, red and green eyes, which apparently only showed up, 8 to 12,000 years ago or something like that. It was a mutation that showed up, and have, some psychic ability in some way. So I don't know anything more than that, but it's possible. It's definitely possible. Yeah, some believe islands float and can flip over, lap or lap. Where do they find these? Yeah. There was literally, I think, a congressional representative who was worried that Guam was gonna float away and flip over or something like that. They are legitimately insanely stupid. All right, so Philip's asking Tessa Marie if she's Basque. Yeah, I've never heard of people with red eyes either. That is kind of weird. All right. So, yeah, I think kind of in the end of 1940s, 1950s, there were all these UFO flaps that were freaking people out. And, the chatter kind of the chatter out there seems to indicate that we might be due for one. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to see what happens, right? Because everybody has a camera in their hand almost at any given time. So is this something that the government is going to try to shut down? And if they try to shut down, are they going to be able to shut it down? And the answer is sure. I mean, they can, just call a local cell provider and have them shut down the cell towers in the area for a week, right? and then they can just go and visit people who've been in the area and confiscate their cell phones, right? I mean, you're gonna have to deal with millions of people, so good luck with that. But still, uh, there's also a pipeline that they can shut down the internet for a period of time. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Just make sure you back up everything right on a external drive so that if somebody shows up and tries to take your stuff, I don't know. It'll be pretty interesting. But again, given the stuff that happened in 2020 and 2021, I don't feel like they're here to protect us. Like they're here to protect the institution. That's what the government is for. They're there to preserve their own jobs and protect the institution, and that's it. Military, they're there to kind of protect us from discrete threats, but everything else, I mean, they really don't do anything but collect taxes and oppress people. So I don't know. Let's see. I'm just kind of going through some of this stuff. The Phoenix Lights might have. So, Philip, the Phoenix Lights was probably the last. But I think there were like much bigger ones in the 80s. I think that was probably a smaller one. All right, I think given that we're near the bottom of the hour, I want to remind folks that you are listening to United Public Radio and Through a Glass Darkly Radio with Sean Patrick Hazlett. Also, you'll see the thumbnail, which I'll change as soon as this thing is over. Terry Lovelace was supposed to appear. I think we had a scheduling issue, so he was not able to attend tonight. I'll try to get him in future weeks, so my apologies for not having him this evening. So Free Spirit Farmer, I think, is asking, what president was it that made a deal with them? I'm assuming he means ETs about taking people. I believe it was, the lore says it was Eisenhower at like Hallowell Air Force Base. There was like a meeting or something. Yeah. So Roger Claiborne says, no, I saw a flying saucer once. So they are real, but it could be our tech. Absolutely. It could also be both, right? It could be tech that we reverse engineered from some other tech. But but something definitely crashed in Roswell. I think there's enough evidence. Like a flying disc definitely crashed in Roswell. And whether or not it was like the Soviets flying it, or, who knows? You come up with any sort of random story about it, but something did crash in Roswell. It wasn't a weather balloon. Yeah, Edgar Casey's an interesting character too. I haven't read much about him, but he was like the sleeping prophet. I think he's kind of in the 1950s or something like that, where he would sleep and then have all these visions about Atlantis and all sorts of crazy stuff. But he was crazy, like precognitive, and would be able to predict things and had the power of prophecy, and just was weird. So, what kind of guests would people like to see in future episodes on this channel? Anyone? It's very quiet. Very quiet. Yeah. Meanwhile, it looks like. Oh yeah, yeah. I need to reach out to Chris Bledsoe again, because it hasn't quite been a year since I last talked to him or interviewed him, but that would be interesting. Ryan, I've reached out, he doesn't respond, so I don't know what the deal is there. Roger, I appreciate it. Thank you for subscribing. Again, most of this I'm generally don't tend to be live. I tend to do interviews of different folks. But by the way, for folks who are here because they wanted to see Terry Lovelace, if you go to the description, I actually have a playlist with 2 other Terry Lovelace episodes. I was gonna kind of go through his story again for the live audience, but if you want to see the one that I did sometime last year, I did 2 interviews with them. It's just you just click on that link and there's a playlist of 2 other videos that you can review, and that'll give you a good sense. But I'm gonna, I'll reach out to him. I think it was just kind of signals got crossed or something. But I'll try to get him. I'll get on the show, not next week because I got Lynn Buchanan on next week, but maybe the week after next. Who's Philip Blair's asking? Or Joshua Cutchin? Say more. I'm not aware who Joshua Cutchin is. Same thing with Marzinski. Who's Marzinski? Who are these 2 folks? By the way, again, Peter Lavenda would be an awesome guest, but I didn't get a response from him yet. So I'll probably try to reach out again. I gotta look at it. I don't even know who Joshua is. Joshua Cutchin. Let's see. Okay, so he's the author of several critically acclaimed books. 2015's A Trojan Feast, The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch. 2016's The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. 2018's Thieves in the Night, a brief history of supernatural child abductions. And 2020's Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomena. Yeah, this would actually be pretty interesting. And then he released a 2-part masterwork, Ecology of Souls, A New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal. Huh. Yeah, looks he's been featured on History Channel. Yeah, I think he would make a fantastic guest. Thank you for that recommendation. I think I probably reach out. Yeah, I was actually trying to get a hold of Barry Fitzgerald because I wanted to talk to him about that topic. Because again, it's a topic. The Fae is a topic I have not explored in any level of depth or detail. So I will definitely have to take a look. Because again, if you notice, I'm kind of covering all aspects of the phenomenon. I don't just focus on UFOs. I don't just focus on the paranormal. And I started with that kind of national security lens, like geopolitical lens, which is why I started with remote viewing, because that's real. Like that's real. Like we ran Project Stargate, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, a number of different projects between the 1970s and 1990s, where you don't run a program for 10 to 25 years that doesn't work. So yeah, I also haven't done anything with Bigfoot, and that's kind of one of these. So Jerry. Okay, so Redall Vox is saying that the other person recommended, Jerry Marzinski, connects the spirits phenomena of schizophrenia and demons. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Paul Sinclair. Where do I know that name? I know that name from somewhere. Yeah, I think most people do. Like, I don't know if you were on, Roger, where I give 2 examples of some kind of precognitive experiences that I've had. If I've interviewed Eric Wargo, who wrote a book called Time Loops, but one thing I recommend everybody to try, and I'm not a great practitioner of this, I need to be better, but as soon as you wake up, if you have a dream that you remember, write it down. Write it down immediately before it fades away. And, if you can do that relatively frequently, over time you will start to notice that there are precognitive episodes in some of those things. They might not be like direct one-on-one correlation, but in the examples that I provided earlier in this broadcast, you'll be amazed at some of the stuff that you find. Oh yeah. Sinclair he's the character in the Da Vinci Code, but probably a different Sinclair. Oh, okay. So he's sounds like he's also a. Yeah, I reached out to them, to Greg and Dana Newkirk. No response. I mean, they're probably still too big for me, right? My channel's probably not big enough for them to spend much time yet, but let me look up Paul Sinclair and see, find out more about Paul Sinclair. There's a lot of Paul Sinclairs. There's a lot of, it's gonna be hard to. Oh, here we go. I bet you it's this guy. No. Oh, you know what? He might be. Yeah. I might need some help with this one. There's so many. There's. Oh wait, no. Here it is. He's a UK-based researcher. Yeah, I can't find anything that's like not video or podcast where I can just read it, because it doesn't help to be, to play something on video while I'm doing that. Yeah. Yeah, he's a UK researcher, but I'll have to look more into that to figure him out. What other guests would you like to? And generally, if I haven't interviewed the guest yet on my own podcast, I usually look at that as kind of a rehearsal. So I would probably do on my own podcast first and heavily produce it, because it's pre-recorded, and then eventually have them come on here. Like Lynn Buchanan's been on my podcast many times, so I kind of know how that's going to go, and he's a super interesting guy. Yeah. So lucid dreaming for precognition. Exactly. Like, usually it's, if somebody shows up in a dream that never shows up in your dream, and it seems like it's out of left field, it's usually a sign to pay attention. So another example that happened to me is I had a dream about the philosophy of Ted Kaczynski, right? Which, for folks who don't know who Ted Kaczynski is, he's the kind of the Unabomber, but his philosophy was all about, kind of how industrialization was getting to the point, basically where we are now, where you have kind of the panopticon following everybody, and like, knowing everything about like a social credit system, sort of stuff like that. Like, he, as crazy as he was, and he was a terrorist, right? He was not a great person, but he saw all this stuff coming, and he wrote about it, and kind of, it was, as a requirement to, he had this manifesto that he put out. Anyway, I had a dream about that, which I was just like, what the F? Like, this is ridiculous. And I woke up that morning, I went downstairs, sat in front of my computer, and Ted Kaczynski was trending because he died that day. Just, can that happen as a coincidence? Sure. I'm sure somebody who's like a hardcore skeptic can say, well, there's no way that you could show. They're right. Like, but it's just really weird. All right, so Philip is saying Walter Bosley would be a good guest to interview about remote viewing. He used Lynn Buchanan's method, possibly solve Oh, century-old occult murder. Interesting. You're probably talking about associative remote viewing, maybe. Um, yeah, I mean the guy was crazy, but he was also unwittingly involved in MK Ultra experiments at Harvard. There was a professor there who was working with the CIA, and like it maybe had some tangential relationship with Ted Kaczynski that, or not Ted Kaczynski, but Sidney Gottlieb, who's the chemist at the CIA. He was like behind all this kind of evil stuff, and it was definitely definitely some evil stuff. So, all right, I think we have a few minutes left. So, what else do folks want to talk about? I think right now is a great time for Q&A, like officially Q&A, because I've been doing a lot of tap dancing tonight that I didn't expect to do. I hope it didn't look like tap dancing, but I fully expected to have a guest, and Oh yeah, so there's a book about or about Dr. Gottlieb. It's called Poisoner in Chief. So folks should definitely check that out. Steve Stockton. All right, I could look into that person in terms of somebody. Oh yeah, William Forstchen. Maybe out of your genre, but interesting. So it's he's the author of 1 Second After series by William Forstchen. Maybe out, yeah, maybe, but he's a kind of a famous kind of fictional author, I think. I haven't heard from him or about him for a while. Um, oh yeah, yeah. This EMP stuff is a little. It's almost as if even if you could prepare, you probably couldn't really prepare, right? If you lose electricity, um, anything that requires refrigeration is done. So the best you can do is make sure you stock up, and then if you can't defend your property, it doesn't matter that you stocked up. Somebody's just going to come in and take it. So yeah. So Free Spirit Farmer said his book is very realistic. Or she says that my husband is retired military. Said it's spooky, very real. Yeah, yeah, it would certainly be a spooky situation for sure. Not not great. So, folks, if you just joined like super late, you're listening to United Public Radio through Glass Darkly Radio with Sean Patrick Hazlett. And unfortunately, if you're looking here for Terry Lovelace, my apologies. Um, for some reason, he was unable to attend. So hopefully, in a future episode, we'll get there. But I will promise I will change the thumbnail before other people come and listen to this whole thing waiting for him. I will. I don't want to do any false advertising. So Philip Blair is saying, have you interviewed Randall Carlson about the Carrington event and related natural disasters in American history? He's a great interview guest. I have not. Someday I definitely will. First of all, I'm like intimidated in the sense that there's some people, if you ask, you're just not going to reply because maybe I'm not big enough. But second, I haven't done enough research on him. I haven't read any of his books. Like I'm fully aware of who he is, with like the Younger Dryas event and things like that, like 12,000 or 11,500 years ago, and a mass extinction event or whatever. But I need to do more research on him before I bring him on or kind of spend that. Yeah. There's a book actually. So Roger Claiborne is talking about buy lots of salt for meat preservation without refrigerator. Yeah, there's a book called Salt, I think, and it's about before refrigeration how controlling salt was like it's like controlling. It was like oil. It was like a geostrategic resource that people fought and died over to control it. Yeah, so Free Spirit Farmer said in an EMP incident, 90% of the U.S. would die in the first year. That's if the EMP was not, if like electric equipment wasn't restored or there wasn't some restorative action. Like if it just wiped out all electrical systems for a year, yeah, you'd have a problem. The other thing too is I think when like if the EMP is strong enough, anything with electric circuit, it might actually like set it on fire. So you have a lot of like things just burning down. People homeless, hungry, and there's an old Spanish proverb that says something to the effect of civilization and anarchy are 7 meals apart. That's what makes it super. Yep, and canning cans for everything. Yeah, I think just buying a ton of cans and just making sure it has a long shelf life. Oh, interesting. Soldier and salary both have salt as their word origin. Interesting. Oh boy. This is the Miami, Florida Mall. So Tessa is saying, did you hear about the crazy theory about what happened at the Miami, Florida Mall a few weeks ago? Some kids turned on some machine to cause a portal to open, and that's where the I think that was like a hoax, but I don't know. Like I have other people who were, swear by it, but it just. The other thing is all these like crazies. They also have like the Nevada aliens, right? The Las Vegas aliens that kind of showed up in somebody's backyard. I feel like a lot of this stuff happened when Grush was, putting out some of his revelations. So I think some of it was deliberate misinformation or disinformation by some faction in the intelligence community to make it look ridiculous. The other thing too is if you've seen like the Jeremy Corbell like jellyfish video, just go to Mick West's site. It's they're balloons. Like they're. I lived in the desert before, and we would have flying trash bags. As soon as I saw that thing, I'm like, this thing is not. It's a nothing burger. And Mick West has a great video that debunks it. I'm not saying like Mick West is my hero or anything like that, but I think you need to just take things. Don't be a skeptic. Don't look into debunking, but take in as much data and information as you can and try to make an informed decision about it. That said, I do not have an informed view on the Miami case, right? I just haven't done my homework on that at all. Oh, well, I think all the cop cars were there because it was like a riot. Well, they were trying to prevent a riot. I think it was like a big group of like high school kids like wreaking havoc. I think that's why a bunch of the cops were there. All right, I'm kind of getting to my allotted time on the radio, so thank you everyone for tuning in. I appreciate you, and thank you for coming to the channel. I'm sorry that Terry wasn't on. I think he thinks it's tomorrow night, so I'll just try to book him in a future episode. I think it's just an honest miscommunication. So we'll be fine. But next week, hopefully you can all tune in to the next episode, which is going to be with Lynn Buchanan, and we're going to go over some good stuff. So good night, everyone, and see you next week.